She was sitting in row 14. He was standing at the microphone. 400 people filled that auditorium. Families in their best clothes. Mothers crying before their sons even walked across the stage. Fathers recording on phones with shaking hands. The air thick with achievement, with arrival, with the specific joy of a thing finally being finished. She had ironed that navy blue dress 3 times. She had worn her mother's earrings, small gold studs, the only jewelry she still owned, because everything else had been converted into something else. Textbooks. Board exam fees. A future that had a name on it. His name. She had practiced what she would say to him. Rehearsed it on every bus ride home from the law office. The words forming in the dark while the city slid past the window. I kept your promise for you. Now you can keep it yourself. She had a card in her purse. A small card, wrapped in tissue paper, folded at the edges the way you fold something you've handled so many times it knows the shape of your hands. A child's handwriting. Pencil, faded almost to nothing. A promise made by an 8-year-old boy who didn't yet know what promises cost. She had kept that card for 12 years. 12 years of 440 alarms. 3 jobs. A back that ached at a specific vertebra she could name, because she was a nurse, because she knew exactly what was breaking and couldn't afford to fix it. 12 years of an envelope in a top drawer that held whatever was left after tuition and electricity. 12 years of a shaking hand she had stopped counting the ibuprofen for because counting meant acknowledging and acknowledging meant stopping and she did not know how to stop. She sat in row 14. She watched her son walk across that stage. She watched him receive that diploma. She watched the word doctor get placed in front of his name like a key fitting a lock she had spent her entire body building. And she was still smiling. She was still smiling when he walked to the microphone for his remarks. She was still smiling when he paused, that deliberate pause, the pause of a man building toward the thing he'd been rehearsing, and said, I want to thank the woman who made all of this possible. Her hands tightened on her purse. The woman who believed in me before I believed in myself. The woman who opened doors for me that I didn't even know existed. The woman who showed me what it looked like to live a life of purpose and generosity. She was already starting to rise. Her knees were straightening. That back, the one that hurt when she sat and when she stood and when she lay down, the one she had carried 12 years of shifts on, that back was straightening for the first time in years. Because this was the moment. This was what the back had been carrying toward. Mom, he said. Could you please stand up? She was halfway out of her seat. And then she saw where he was looking. He wasn't looking at row 14. He was looking at row 3. And in row 3, a woman in silk and pearls was rising from her chair with her hand pressed to her chest and tears on her face that had never known what it was to be too tired to cry. The auditorium erupted in applause. Ruth Delane sat back down. The motion was small. Almost invisible. The seat absorbed her weight without a sound. The man beside her didn't look over. The woman on her other side was clapping. Nobody noticed. Nobody noticed a woman fold back into her chair like a letter being returned to its envelope. Nobody noticed her hands go still on her purse, completely still, the stillness of hands that had decided there was nothing left to reach for. Nobody noticed the tin box inside that purse. Or the card inside the tin box. Or the 12 years inside the card. Nobody noticed. But here's what I need you to understand before this story goes any further. This isn't just a story about a son who forgot where he came from. This is a story about what it costs to love someone completely. What it does to a body. What it asks of a life. And what happens, what really happens, when the bill finally comes due. Because that moment in row 14. That wasn't the end of this story. That was the beginning of the reckoning. And what happened next, no one was prepared for. Before we go further, to our new viewers joining today, subscribe and say hello in the comments. I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Today's warm shout-out goes to Jocelyn from the United States, Wanda from Georgia, and Juliet from Jamaica. Thank you for being part of our family. Subscribe now and comment below so I can welcome you too. Before we get to what happened after that auditorium, I need you to understand something. You need to understand what it actually means to work 3 jobs. Not the idea of it. Not the phrase. The actual, physical, daily reality of a human being converting herself, her body, her sleep, her health, her time, into someone else's future. Because when people hear she worked 3 jobs, they nod. They think, that's hard. And then they move on. But Ruth Delane didn't get to move on. She had a name for the exact vertebra that was failing her. L4. Left of center. She knew this because she was a nurse, and nurses know things about bodies that most people never have to know about their own. She knew what she needed. She needed an MRI, rest, a specialist, a week without lifting. She needed things that weren't in the envelope. So here's the first question I want you to hold on to. How does a woman give 12 years of her body to someone else's dream, and end up invisible at the moment it comes true? But that's not the only question. Because there's another person in this story who matters just as much. A woman named Victoria Ashford who lived in a house with a circular driveway and a front door painted the exact shade of green you see in magazines about homes you will never own. Victoria wasn't a villain. That's important to understand right now. What she did wasn't theft. It was something quieter, something more insidious, something the English language barely has a word for. Erosion. The slow wearing away of a shoreline by water that doesn't know it's destroying anything. Water just moves. It goes where the path is easiest. So here's question 2, if no one did anything wrong, how did everything go so right for some people and so terribly wrong for others? And then there's Marcus himself. Marcus, who at age 8 sat on a linoleum kitchen floor with his math workbook while his mother made rice and beans after her night shift, and watched her press her thumb into the same spot on her lower back she always pressed, and understood, without being told, without having words for it, that those hands needed care. Marcus, who took her rough, cracked hands in his small ones every night and pressed his thumbs into her palms the way she had shown him. Carefully. Around the cracks. Because these hands were the most important objects in his world. That Marcus. When did that child become the man who stood at a microphone in front of 400 people and looked at the wrong row? That is the question this whole story is really asking. And here's what you're not ready to hear yet, the answer isn't what you think. Because here's the truth that will reframe everything once we get there. Marcus knew Ruth was in row 14. He saw the navy blue dress. He saw her begin to stand. He saw the exact moment she understood, and he watched her sit back down. He let it happen. And he still doesn't fully understand why. But someone else in this story does understand. A woman named Ernestine Okafor, who worked beside Ruth at Maplewood Senior Living and had been watching, really watching, for 6 months. Watching with the specific attention of a person who has learned the difference between seeing and understanding. Ernestine is going to make a phone call. And that phone call is going to do what 12 years of sacrifice couldn't. But before we get there, we need to go back. All the way back. To a small apartment and a 4:40 alarm and a woman whose hands knew the schedule before the rest of her did. Because you cannot understand what happened in that auditorium without understanding what it cost to get there. And the cost was everything. The alarm went off at 4:40 a.m. Ruth Delane had stopped hearing it as a sound years ago. It had become something else, a border between one kind of tired and another. The signal that the first shift was starting and the body needed to get vertical regardless of what it wanted. She dressed in the dark. She had dressed in the dark for 12 years. Scrubs. Compression socks. White nursing shoes with the sole wearing thin on the left heel, because she favored that leg when she stood for hours. She did not turn on the light. The studio apartment was small enough that her hands knew the dresser, the doorknob, the kitchen counter without assistance. She ate a piece of toast with peanut butter standing at the counter. She drank water from the tap. She swallowed 3 ibuprofen without looking at the bottle because the bottle was always in the same place and the dosage was always the same and the pain was always in the same spot. She did not go for the MRI she needed because the MRI was not in the envelope. The envelope lived in the top drawer of the dresser. Whatever was left after Marcus's tuition payment and the electric bill was what she had. The MRI could wait. The MRI had been waiting for 2 years. But here's what she didn't know yet. The body keeps its own calendar. And that calendar has due dates. Marcus was 8 years old when he first pressed his thumbs into his mother's palms. He had watched her do it to herself, sitting on the couch after dinner, pressing her own hands against her own legs, rolling her knuckles slowly, her eyes half closed. He had asked her what she was doing. She had shown him. Here. Press here. Like this. Not too hard. And so he had. He took her right hand in both of his, small hands around large ones, careful around the cracks in her knuckles, the ones that never fully healed because she never stopped using them, and he pressed. She closed her eyes. She leaned her head back against the couch. She didn't say anything. He understood that this was the closest thing to rest she had. He said one evening, his thumbs moving in slow circles across her palm, "When I am a doctor, you will not have to work 3 jobs anymore." She opened her eyes and looked at him. She smiled. She said, "Just the one is fine. The one where I sit down." He laughed. She laughed. It was not a complicated moment. It was the kind of moment that lives in a house for years without anyone photographing it or writing it down. The truest thing about that house. The foundation everything else was resting on. 2 years later, he would take a piece of cardstock from the art supplies at school and sit at the kitchen table with a pencil and press hard because he wanted the words to last. "Mom, when I am a doctor I'll buy you a house with a garden." He gave it to her on a Tuesday evening for no occasion. She held it for a long time. She put it in a tin box. She did not tell him that she read it every night because she did not want him to feel the weight of being someone's reason for continuing. That was not a weight for a 10-year-old to carry. So she carried it instead. But she didn't know, that card would become the only proof of a promise that was slowly being rewritten. Marcus got a partial scholarship to Whitfield Academy when he was 14. He was smart. He had always been smart. Ruth had known this the way you know things about your child that exist below the level of pride, below the level of language, as basic and undeniable as the fact of his breathing. But Whitfield was a different world. The other students had 2 parents and 1 house and no jobs between them that required a uniform with a logo on the back. Marcus was smart and he was proud and he was 14 and he understood, in that wordless, bodily way that teenagers understand class, that there was a gap between the world he came from and the world he was entering. And the gap was not just money. It was ease. The specific, unearned, invisible ease of people who have never had to explain themselves. Ruth drove to pick him up one Wednesday afternoon wearing the cleaning company polo. Navy blue. Logo on the back. She had come straight from the law office. No time to change. She was standing beside her car in the pickup line when she saw Marcus come out the front doors with 2 other boys. He saw her from the top of the steps. She saw the moment he saw her. She saw something cross his face that she had never seen before. Not shame, exactly. Something worse. A quick calculation. A decision made in the body before the mind had time to intervene. He turned. He said something to the boys beside him. He walked around the side of the building and came out through the back gate and approached the car from the other direction, so that the boys he'd been walking with did not see him get into a car with a woman wearing a cleaning company uniform. Ruth saw all of this. She drove home. She ate dinner alone. She washed the dishes. She went to bed. She did not mention it the next morning. Or any morning after. She added it to the list of things she carried without putting down. That same semester, Marcus began spending time at the home of a classmate named Derek Ashford. Derek's mother was a woman named Victoria Ashford. Victoria was married to Dr. Leonard Ashford, a cardiothoracic surgeon at Emory who played golf on Saturdays. Their house had a circular driveway and a front door painted a specific shade of green. The kind of green that signals to anyone who sees it, we have not had to worry about money for long enough that we have started caring about paint colors. Victoria was not a villain. This cannot be said enough. She was a woman who moved through the world with confidence and warmth and a genuine desire to help people she liked. She liked Marcus. She saw in him something that was easy to see, intelligence, hunger, potential, the specific brightness of a young man who was reaching for something real. She opened her home. She opened her table. Dinners became weekends. Weekends became holidays. She took Derek and Marcus to visit college campuses during spring break. She introduced Marcus to surgeons and department chairs who shook his hand with the specific grip that contains evaluation and approval built in. She paid for his MCAT prep course. She did this without asking Ruth. She told Marcus it was an investment in his future and that he should not feel guilty about accepting help from people who believed in him. Investment. That word was specific. Ruth had never used that word. Ruth used words like manage and stretch and figure it out. Ruth's vocabulary was the vocabulary of survival. Victoria's was the vocabulary of strategy. And Marcus was 17, and he did not yet understand that both languages were love. He only understood that one of them felt lighter to carry. He came home one evening wearing a shirt Ruth had never seen. Light blue Oxford cloth. A small emblem on the chest. She looked at it from across the kitchen. She said, "Where did you get that shirt?" He said, "Mrs. Ashford gave it to me. I needed one for the hospital tour." Ruth looked at the shirt. At the collar. The cuffs. The way it fit him, like it had been chosen by someone who knew his size. She said nothing. That night, she took it from the laundry pile and washed it with the rest of his clothes. She folded it and put it in his drawer. She did this without comment. Without expression. Without any outward indication that she understood what she was doing. She was washing evidence that someone else was dressing her son for a life she was paying for with her body. There is a specific way a person disappears from your life that doesn't look like disappearing. It looks like being busy. It looks like growth. It looks like success. And by the time you understand what's actually happening, the distance is already so wide that closing it would require one of you to admit it exists. That is what happened between Ruth and Marcus. The calls shifted first. He began calling Victoria Mrs. A instead of Mrs. Ashford. The abbreviation was small. But Ruth heard it the way nurses hear changes in a patient's breathing, a shortening, a familiarity, a closing of distance that meant the distance somewhere else was growing. He talked about dinners at the Ashford house the way he used to talk about their kitchen. With warmth. With the specific comfort of someone describing home. Ruth did not say, "Stop going there." She did not say, "I am your mother, not her." She did not say any of the things that lived in the back of her throat on the nights when Marcus came home smelling like a house that had candles and a dishwasher and a father who was home for dinner. She said none of it because she was afraid. Afraid that saying it would make her the obstacle between Marcus and the life she was working 3 jobs to give him. So she said nothing. She went to work. She came home. She washed the shirts that someone else bought for her son. She folded them. She put them in his drawer. She did not mention it. But here's the truth that was building underneath the silence: love without language becomes invisible. And invisible love is the kind that gets mistaken for absence. The year Marcus left for college was the year Ruth sold the house. It was a small house on a quiet street. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. A kitchen with a window above the sink where she had stood thousands of times washing dishes and watching Marcus play in the yard. She had bought it with 15 years of saving, not investing, saving. The difference between those 2 words was the difference between Ruth's life and Victoria Ashford's life. Tuition was $5,400 a year. The scholarship covered a third. The rest came from somewhere. And somewhere was the house. She moved into the studio apartment on Piedmont. 400 square feet. 1 window. A kitchen that was also the living room that was also the bedroom. She set up the nightstand. She put the tin box in the top drawer. She went to work the next morning at 4:40 a.m. the way she went to work every morning, because the body had learned the schedule, and the schedule did not account for grief. She didn't tell Marcus she had sold the house. She didn't want him to know the cost. That was the mistake that would haunt her for years, not the selling, but the silence around the selling. The years that followed were a specific kind of arithmetic. Marcus needed books. Marcus needed equipment. Marcus needed board exam fees. Each need arrived as a phone call, brief and practical. The voice of a young man who had learned to ask for money the way you ask a bank, with the expectation that the transaction would be completed and the conversation would end. He called one evening during her shift at the law office. She was on the 3rd floor vacuuming the conference room. She turned off the vacuum. She answered. He needed $800 for Step 1 materials. Due by Friday. He was sorry to ask. She said, "I'll figure it out." He did not ask what figure it out meant. He did not ask if she had $800. He did not ask how she was, or whether her back still hurt, or whether she was eating. He said, "Thanks, Mom," and hung up. She stood in the conference room with the phone in her hand and the vacuum at her feet and $800 already being subtracted from the envelope in her mind. She would skip the dental cleaning she had scheduled. She would eat rice and beans for 2 weeks instead of 1. She would remove herself from the equation 1 piece at a time. He did not ask. She did not tell. And then the calls got shorter. The calls had once been long. He would tell her about a professor, a case, a patient he'd seen during rounds. She would listen. He would ask if she was tired. She would say she was fine. But last Tuesday, the call lasted 2 minutes and 14 seconds. The Tuesday before that, he hadn't picked up at all. She had called twice and left no message. Because she did not know what message to leave for a person who used to talk to you for an hour and now gives you 2 minutes and a reason to hang up. What no one realized, the calls weren't getting shorter because he was busy. They were getting shorter because the longer he stayed in that other world, the harder it became to hold both worlds at once. And rather than feel the weight of that, he let one of them quietly go. Her hands had started shaking 6 months earlier. Not all the time. Just when she was tired, which was most of the time. A tremor in the right hand, fine, barely visible unless you were looking for it. She was looking for it because she was a nurse. She knew what a tremor in the dominant hand at her age could mean. She also knew what it probably meant in her case. Her body was running out of whatever it had been running on for 12 years and was beginning to send notices. She ignored the notices. She took 4 ibuprofen in the morning instead of 3. Then she stopped counting. She had started avoiding the mirror after 10 p.m. because the woman in the mirror at 10 p.m. looked older than the woman she thought she was. The face in the mirror had lines that told time more honestly than any clock. The hands in the mirror shook when they weren't holding something. The eyes in the mirror were tired in a way that sleep could not fix, because the tiredness was not in the muscles. It was underneath them. She read the card every night. The pencil had faded until you had to hold it at an angle to catch the light. But the words were still there. Mom, when am a doctor ill buy you a house with a garden? She placed it on her chest and closed her eyes. And the weight of it was nothing. And the weight of it was everything. And then the invitation arrived. A thick envelope with embossed lettering. Marcus James Delane, Doctor of Medicine. She read his name. She read it again. She held the invitation in both hands, and her legs decided without consulting her that they were finished standing. She sat down on the kitchen floor. Her back against the cabinet below the sink. The same spot where Marcus used to sit with his math workbook. The same linoleum. The same cabinet. The same floor. She did not cry. She laughed, a sound she had not made in a long time. Involuntary and real. The sound of a woman who had spent 12 years converting her body into someone else's future and was now holding the receipt. She sat on that floor for a long time. She thought about the 3 jobs and the sold house and the ibuprofen and the shaking hands and the shirts she had washed that someone else had bought. She thought about all of it and she laughed again, because the math had finally come out even. The cost and the result were in the same room for the first time in 12 years. And the result was written in embossed letters on a thick piece of paper and his name was on it. She did not yet know what would happen at that ceremony. She was still smiling. And that's when everything changed. If you're still feeling this, drop "I'm still here" in the comments. I see every single one of you. The morning of the graduation, Ruth woke without the alarm. Her body knew this was a different day. The way bodies know things, in the muscles, in the specific quality of alertness that arrives when something you have been waiting for has finally arrived. She showered. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at herself with the kind of attention she normally reserved for patients. She saw the gray at her temples. The lines around her eyes. Her hands, still swollen from yesterday's shift. The callus on the right palm from the mop handle. Another at the base of the left thumb from turning patients. She put on the navy blue dress. She had bought it at a store she normally walked past without entering. She had stood in the fitting room in front of a 3-way mirror and looked at herself from angles she didn't normally see. And the woman in the mirror had looked like someone who might sit in the front row of a graduation ceremony. Someone whose son was about to become a doctor. Someone who had earned the right to be there. She put on her mother's earrings. Small gold studs, the only jewelry she still owned, the only thing she hadn't converted into tuition. She took the card from the tin box, wrapped it in tissue paper, placed it in her purse beside her wallet and her keys and her bus pass. She had practiced what she would say. I kept your promise for you. Now you can keep it yourself. She locked the apartment. She walked to the bus stop. The morning was warm and bright and felt like it was cooperating with something. She arrived 40 minutes early. She found the auditorium. She chose row 14, close enough to see his face clearly when he walked across the stage, far enough not to be in the way. She sat down. She placed her purse on her lap. She waited. The auditorium filled around her, families with cameras and flowers, fathers in suits, mothers in dresses chosen with the same care she'd chosen hers. She watched them and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she belonged in a room. That the room had been built for exactly this purpose and she had paid the price of admission in full and the seat was hers. She was still smiling when the lights dimmed. She was still smiling when they called his name. She was still smiling when he walked to the microphone. But that wasn't the worst part. I need to stop here and take you back 3 weeks. Because before we can understand what happened after that auditorium, you need to know what happened on the 3rd floor of the law office on a Thursday evening. Ruth had been vacuuming the East Conference room. She felt the floor tilt. Her vision narrowed to a point. The point went dark. She fell. The vacuum kept running beside her on the carpet. The security guard found her 8 minutes later on his rounds. He called 911. The ambulance came. The ER doctor, younger than Marcus, told her she was severely anemic, dehydrated, and showing early markers of renal insufficiency. He told her she needed rest. He told her she needed follow-up care with a nephrologist. He told her she needed to stop working 3 jobs. She said, "I will." She was discharged the following morning. She took the bus to Maplewood. She clocked in at 5:15 a.m. She went to room 14. She turned Mr. Washington. Her hands shook while she did it. She had never known how to stop. Stopping was not a skill she had ever been taught. What no one realized, the collapse was not just a medical event. It was the body finally saying out loud what Ruth had been refusing to say for 12 years. The body tells the truth even when the mouth is still deciding. And someone was listening. Her name was Ernestine Okafor. 58 years old. Nurse's aide at Maplewood for 11 years. She had come from Lagos when she was 34, 2 suitcases, a nursing certificate, and the specific understanding that the world does not owe you anything, but that you owe the world your attention. She had worked in Brooklyn, Newark, Atlanta. The long geography of immigrant work. Quiet in the way of people who listen more than they speak. She had been watching Ruth for 6 months. She had watched the tremor in the right hand get worse. She had watched Ruth brace herself against the wall when she thought no one was looking. She had watched Ruth eat less and move slower and carry herself with the rigid discipline of someone compensating for something that discipline cannot fix. She had said nothing. Because saying something requires knowing what to say. And for 6 months, she had not known. After Ruth collapsed, she knew. She started with food. Because food was immediate and required no explanation. The first Tuesday, she left a container on Ruth's locker shelf before the shift. Jollof rice with chicken, covered in foil, still warm. A piece of masking tape on the foil. 4 words in blue ink. "You look like you forgot to feed yourself." Ruth opened her locker at 5:45 a.m. and saw the container. She stood looking at it for a moment. She picked it up. She could feel the warmth through the foil. She took it to the break room. She sat down. She opened it. She ate. It was the first meal in weeks that she actually tasted. The rice was seasoned in a way that reminded her of nothing in her own life, which was part of why it worked. It belonged to someone else's kitchen. Someone else's hands. Someone else's care. Receiving it required nothing from her except sitting still long enough to eat. She finished it. She washed the container in the break room sink. She returned it to Ernestine's locker with the masking tape still on it. She did not write a note back. Ernestine did not expect one. The containers continued. Every Tuesday. Sometimes Thursday. Always warm. Always covered in foil. Always with a note. Drink some water. Eat before shift. Your shoes are getting loose, tighten them. Ruth ate. She drank. She tightened her shoes. She said nothing about any of it. And Ernestine asked nothing about any of it. And the 2 women existed in a specific kind of silence that was not empty, but was full of the thing that happens when one person decides to pay attention to another without requiring anything in return. But Ernestine was forming a plan. And the plan was not small. On a Wednesday evening, Ernestine sat at her kitchen table with her daughter Adiz and a laptop screen. She asked Adiz to help her find someone on the internet. She said it carefully, the way she said everything, with precision, with purpose, without waste. Adiz asked who she was looking for. Ernestine said, the son of a woman I work with. He is a doctor. His name is Marcus Delane. Adiz found him in less than a minute. LinkedIn. Dr. Marcus Delane, resident, internal medicine. His profile photograph showed him in a white coat, standing beside 3 other people in what appeared to be a living room. A man in a blazer. A woman with short hair and gold earrings. A younger man who looked like the woman's son. They were all smiling. Marcus was in the center. He looked like he belonged to them. Ernestine looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the woman with the gold earrings. She looked at Marcus's face. She understood something in that photograph, the way she had understood things in labor rooms in Lagos, watching women at the moment the body takes over and the truth becomes visible. She recognized the shape of a man standing in the wrong family. She asked Adiz to find a phone number. The following morning, from the parking lot of Maplewood, before her shift, Ernestine called the hospital. She asked for Dr. Marcus Delane. She was transferred. He picked up on the 4th ring. His voice was professional. Efficient. Slightly impatient, the way residents are always slightly impatient, always between one task and the next. She said, my name is Ernestine Okafor. I work with your mother at Maplewood Senior Living. She collapsed last week at her evening job. She was taken to the emergency room. She has been diagnosed with anemia and early kidney disease. She did not call you because she did not want to interrupt your new life. I am calling because someone should. The line was quiet. She could hear the hospital behind him. The distant sounds of pages and machines. The specific noise of a building full of people who are sick and people who are trying to make them better. He did not speak. She said one more thing. She said it because it was the truth, and because the truth was what she had come to deliver. I have watched her hands shake for 6 months. She still makes the beds gentler than anyone I know. She hung up. She had said what needed saying. She put her phone in her purse. She walked into Maplewood. She clocked in. She went to work. And that sentence, that one sentence, became a stone in the current of Marcus Delane's life. The water moved around it. But the stone did not move. Marcus stood in a hospital corridor with the phone in his hand for 30 seconds after Ernestine hung up. Then he walked to the restroom. He stood at the sink. He turned on the faucet. He washed his hands. And he thought about his mother's hands. Not his own, smooth, clean, the nails trimmed short, the skin unmarked, the hands of a man who had been trained in excellent rooms. He thought about her hands. The dry knuckles. The crack across the right palm that never fully healed. The specific warmth of those hands when she cupped his face as a child. Her hands rubbing small circles between his shoulder blades at 2 a.m. when he was sick. Her hands opening envelopes she never let him see. She still makes the beds gentler than anyone I know. The sentence was lodged in his chest like a piece of glass. He dried his hands. He took out his phone. He opened the call log. He scrolled back. For missed calls from Ruth Delane on the day of his graduation. 2:14 p.m. 2:23 p.m. 2:31 p.m. 2:38 p.m. Within 40 minutes of each other. No voicemails. He understood now why she had left no message. She hadn't trusted her voice. She had called because her body needed to do something. And calling was the only action available. And each time the voicemail picked up, she'd hung up because she could not say what needed to be said without the sound of it betraying everything she was feeling. And she would not give him that. She would not give anyone that. He put the phone back in his pocket. Here's what you think the twist is, Marcus didn't know how bad things were. He didn't know about the collapse, the kidney disease, the shaking hands. He didn't realize how much she had sacrificed. He made a thoughtless mistake and now he's going to wake up. That would be a satisfying story. But it's not the true one. Because here is what Marcus had known. He had known Ruth was in row 14. He had seen the navy blue dress. He had seen her mother's earrings catching the light. He had watched her begin to rise from her seat when he said the word mom. He had seen it all. And he had not changed course. That is the first twist. The mistake wasn't ignorance. The mistake was a choice. A choice that had been made months earlier, in a living room, when a question was asked and he hadn't said no. The decision was made in the Ashford living room. Marcus had been rehearsing his remarks. Victoria had been sitting across from him listening. When he finished, she had said, casually, almost as an afterthought. "Are you going to mention me?" He had not said no. That was the moment. Not the stage. Not the microphone. Not the word mom. The moment was in a living room when a question was asked and the not saying became a direction, and the direction became a speech, and the speech became a public thing that could not be taken back. Now here is the second twist. The one that reframes everything. Victoria Ashford, for all the things she had given Marcus, for all the doors she had opened, for all the ways she had shaped his path, Victoria had never once asked Ruth's permission. She had never once considered what it might cost Ruth to watch her son receive from another woman what she had spent her body paying for. Not because Victoria was cruel. But because she had never been required to think about it. That is the truth that redefines this entire story. The harm was not done by malice. The harm was done by the specific privilege of people who have never had to calculate cost, who have never had to manage an envelope, or swallow ibuprofen before a shift, or wash another woman's gift off their child's back in the dark. Victoria had never needed to convert love into arithmetic. So she didn't know that was what Ruth was doing. So she didn't know what she was taking. And Marcus, raised between two worlds, standing at the seam where survival met strategy, had spent 6 years learning to live in Victoria's world. He had learned its vocabulary, its ease, its warmth. And somewhere in the learning, he had stopped translating back. He had not forgotten his mother. He had forgotten the language she spoke. And that sentence, that realization, is what drove Marcus to leave the Ashford house that evening. He put down his fork at that dinner table. He said, "My mother collapsed last week. She's been working 3 jobs since I was in high school. She sold her house to pay for my medical school tuition. Did you know that?" The table went quiet. Victoria said, "I knew she worked hard. I didn't know the specifics." The word specifics entered the room and sat down. Marcus reached into his pocket. He took out the key to the Ashford front door, the key Victoria had given him 2 years ago when he began staying regularly. He placed it on the granite counter beside the salt shaker. He looked at it there. A small brass key. A door that had been easy to walk through because someone else had been holding it open. He said, "Thank you for everything you've done for me." He meant it. Because gratitude is not something you owe less of because the rest of the equation has changed. He walked to the front door. He opened it. He closed it the way you close a door when you understand that the sound of it is not the point. He stood on the porch of the Ashford house. He took out his phone. He was not ready to call Ruth yet. He needed to be something other than what he had been when he stood on that stage. And becoming that required more than a phone call. It required showing up. He knocked on the door of the studio apartment on Piedmont at 6:14 in the evening. He knew she would be home. He had always known her schedule. He had simply stopped paying attention to it the way you stop hearing a clock that has been ticking your entire life. Ruth opened the door. She was wearing the cleaning company polo. Her shoes were on. Her keys were in her hand. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without rearrangement, without making the moment easier for the person standing in front of her. She said, "I have work in 40 minutes. He said nothing. She stepped aside. He walked in. The apartment was 400 square feet. He understood this not in numbers but in his body, the doctor's instinct that calculates the dimensions of a room by the space between the walls. 4 steps from the door to the kitchen counter. 3 steps from the counter to the bed. The bed was a single. The sheets were white and tight at the corners, made with the precision of a woman who had spent 12 years making beds for other people and could not bring herself to leave her own unmade. He stood in the center of the room and looked at it the way you look at evidence in a case you've refused to examine until now. The 2 cleaning company polos, one hanging on the back of the door, one folded on the dresser. 2 uniforms because the schedule required her to wash one while wearing the other and there was no margin for error. The ibuprofen on the kitchen counter, he picked up the bottle, checked the dosage, counted the remaining pills, did the arithmetic the way doctors do arithmetic. The number told him she had been taking more than the recommended amount for a long time. The compression socks drying on the shower rod. The shoes by the door with the worn left heel. Then he saw the tin box. It was in the bottom drawer of the dresser. Not the nightstand. Not beside the bed where it had lived for years. It had been moved. He understood what the moving meant. He opened it. The card was inside. He unwrapped it. His handwriting at 8 years old, the letters slanting right because he was left-handed. The faded pencil. The paper soft at the edges from years of being held by the same hands, night after night. Mom, when I am a doctor, I'll buy you a house with a garden. His hands were shaking. He sat down on the floor. Not on the bed. Not on the chair. The floor. Because the floor was what was available when the body stops cooperating and the mind has nothing left to offer in the way of structure. He sat on the linoleum of his mother's studio apartment in his white coat, with the card in his hands, and he did not perform anything. Ruth looked at her son on the floor. She had seen this before, not this specific thing, but the shape of it. A person arriving at the end of whatever they had been holding up, finding that the holding was finished. She had seen it in patience. She had seen it in herself on this same kitchen floor the morning the graduation invitation arrived. She sat down. Not close. Not yet. Across from him, her back against the kitchen cabinet. She left the distance between them because the distance was not hostility. It was the appropriate space of a woman who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and needed to see what he would do with it before she closed it. He said, I called her mom. She said, I know. He said, I was wrong. The silence lasted longer than any silence should. She said, you were not wrong about needing something I couldn't give you. You were wrong about thinking that meant I wasn't enough. She was not performing forgiveness. She was sitting on the floor of her apartment in her cleaning company uniform with her keys still in her hand, and she was telling him the truest thing she knew, that love is not measured by what you are able to provide. It is measured by what you are willing to lose. She had been willing to lose everything, including him. She had lost him. And she was still here. And the floor was holding both of them. That was enough for now. He put the card down on the floor between them. He took out his phone. He called the hospital. He said, this is Dr. Delane. I need to switch my shift tomorrow. I will not be available until noon. He looked at Ruth. I am driving you to the doctor tomorrow morning. I'm not asking. She looked at him. She was still holding her keys. She had been gripping them in her right hand, the hand that shook, the hand that had been lacing boots and turning patients and filing claims and pushing vacuum cleaners for 12 years without stopping. She put them down. She set them on the floor beside the card. The small sound of metal on linoleum. She nodded. No, you don't have to. No, I'm fine. No reaching for the phrases she'd used to keep people at a distance for 12 years. Just a nod. And in that nod was the first time in 12 years that Ruth Delane allowed someone else to carry something for her. He went to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator. Eggs. Bread. A jar of peanut butter almost empty. He found a pan under the counter. He turned on the stove. He made scrambled eggs. Ruth sat on the chair by the counter and watched her son's hands move across her kitchen. Clean hands. Smooth. No calluses. Moving with the precision of hands trained to be gentle with things that are fragile. But she had taught him that, not in medical school. In this kitchen. In the old kitchen on the old street when he was small and she was young and the promise was still written in fresh pencil and everything was still possible. His hands were cooking for her. Her hands had cooked for him for 18 years. The circle was not complete. Not yet. Not all at once. But the hands that she had held and bandaged and watched grow from small to large, those hands were now setting a plate in front of her, and the gesture was so ordinary and so specific that it contained everything that needed to be said without either of them saying it. They ate. The following morning, he pulled up to the curb at 8:15. She got in. She put on her seatbelt. She held her purse on her lap with both hands. The city moved past the windows. She opened the tin box. She took out the card. She held it out to him. He took it with one hand, the other on the wheel. She said, I kept your promise for you. Now you can keep it yourself. He folded it carefully. He placed it in the breast pocket of his white coat, the pocket over his heart, where he kept his pen and his badge and the small tools of the life she had paid for. The card disappeared into the white fabric. And Ruth watched it go. And she understood, for the first time, that it had finally arrived where it was supposed to be. Not a house. Not a garden. Just a pocket, close to the chest of the person who wrote it. Carried now by the person who could understand what it had cost to keep. And that's when she realized, the truth didn't just change his life. It revealed who he had always been. And who she had always been. And that those two things were not as separate as 12 years of silence had made them seem. Before I let you go, I want to sit with you for just a moment. Because this story deserves more than a quick reaction. Think about what Ruth did for 12 years. 3 jobs. A sold house. A back she couldn't afford to fix. Hands that shook in the dark. A card she read every night like a prayer, not because it gave her hope, but because it reminded her why the alarm going off at 4:40 a.m. still meant something. And then ask yourself honestly, what would you have done in her position? When Marcus avoided her at that school pickup, when you saw the calculation cross his face as he walked the long way around the building, would you have said something? Or would you have driven home in silence, the way Ruth did, and added it to the list of things you carry without putting down? And here's the harder question. Was Victoria Ashford wrong? She never asked Ruth's permission. She never considered the cost of what she was taking. But she genuinely loved Marcus. She opened real doors. She provided things Ruth could not. She was not lying when she rose from that chair in row 3 with her hand on her chest. Was she wrong? Was she guilty of something the law has no name for, taking a child's loyalty not through cruelty but through convenience? Through being present in the ways that are easiest to see? Comment below. I want to hear what you actually think. Not the polite answer. The real one. And Marcus. He was wrong. He knows he was wrong. He said it on the floor of a 400 square foot apartment with his hands shaking, holding a piece of paper that should have broken him open years ago. But does he deserve forgiveness? He's already a doctor. The life has been built. Ruth's body paid the price and the transaction is complete. Does it matter now that he sat down on that floor? Does showing up with eggs and a doctor's appointment and a breast pocket undo what happened in row 14? I believe the answer is yes. But I also believe forgiveness is not the same as undoing. You can forgive a debt without pretending the money was never owed. You can let someone back in without forgetting the shape of the door they walked through on the way out. That's what Ruth did. Not because it was easy. Because she was a woman who had spent 12 years choosing the hard thing and finding that it was always, underneath, the true thing. And Ernestine. Who is your Ernestine? That is the question I want to leave you with. Not the dramatic one, not the debate, not the question with 2 sides and a comment section argument attached to it. Who showed up for you when the people who were supposed to didn't? Who left the container of food on the shelf with masking tape and 4 words and no expectation of anything in return? Who made the phone call they didn't have to make, the one that changed the direction of everything? If you have an Ernestine, put their name in the comments. Or just say I have one. That's enough. And if you've been someone's Ernestine, if you've left the food, made the call, asked the small questions that were really the large ones, then I want you to know something. The not knowing was never the point. The doing was always the point. It was always, only, the doing. If you thought this story was powerful, wait until you hear what happens when the debt runs the other direction. The next story we're telling is about a father who gave up everything for a daughter who never knew his name, and the moment they finally stood in the same room. You are not ready. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment, I read every single one. This community is why I keep telling these stories. See you in the next one.